The first new parts. G'day everyone, ready with the next part of the S600 build. Finally ready to put something back together rather than just stripping stuff down. So I've got the steering rack here, we'll start assembling it. So the new parts we're going to be putting in is an oil seal and a bearing. I went to the effort to buy a made in Japan bearing. It's probably unnecessary, but it's got a cool holographic thing on it, so we'll put those in. So the first part we're going to look at is our pinion. The new bearing goes on the end of it. Swapping bearings is pretty simple. The main thing is you can't knock them on by the outer race. So because I'm pressing this bearing over a shaft, I need to find something to hit it on by the inside race, because if I hit it by the outside, all the force is going through the balls and it'll damage it. Same as if I'm pressing this bearing into a hole, I have to hit it by the outside race and not the inside one, otherwise you'll damage the balls. So I'll find a tube to fit over it and we'll knock it on. There, so that's seated all the way against the teeth at the bottom. Now you would have noticed the old bearing I took off this in the other video was open, it didn't have these side seals on it. These seals are to keep the grease in the bearing, and the old setup, there's an oil seal on here, and then the bearing also had some of the grease out of the rack in it. These modern bearings, compared to the 1960s one, these modern bearings, the grease in them is good, they've got the correct amount of packed grease and everything in them. If you wanted to, you could pick these seals, just pop out and you could run it as is, but I'm going to leave the seals on there because it's another barrier to stop stuff getting into the rack, and the factory, the people that made the bearing probably know better about how much grease should be in it, what kind of grease, know better than I do, so we'll leave the seals on the bearing. So the other new piece I have is a new lip seal. This is the original one pressed in this little ring, so we'll knock it out. Generally, stuff like this, you want to push it off straight, so I'll give a couple of knocks to one side, a couple to the other, and we'll work our way backwards and forwards until it's popped out all the way. Cool, we'll give this a clean up now. So this is our old seal, and this is our new one. You probably can't read it in the video, but the part numbers on the seals are really simple. They're easier than bearings. This one literally just says 24, 35, 8. And what that means is a 24 inside diameter, 35 outside diameter, and 8 millimeters thick. I couldn't actually get an exact replacement for this one. So this one is a 24, 35, 7. So the outside is the same, the inside is the same. But if you look, the new one is 7 mil thick and the old one is 8 mil thick. So that's not necessarily a problem. We just look at this. 7 mil is definitely going to fit in the hole. 7 mil is still going to match up with the part that it runs on, so the 7 mil seal will work just fine for what we're doing. I was able to find my nice Japanese bearing, but unfortunately I couldn't find an 8 mil seal. So fitting the seal into the housing for it, pretty much the same as the bearing. Get a piece of tube that's a nice fit on the outside of the seal, and then we can knock it into place. So now that our seal's in, this is the part that goes in the seal. I should have masked this off before I painted it, but I forgot, so I'm going to go and clean the paint off this, because we obviously don't want the seal running on a painted surface. This is all nice and cleaned up now. We've got a nice smooth surface for our seal to run on. So we're just going to clean up this little bush that we damaged on the way out. I've got a square here. This should be a nice flat machine surface. It's a little bit pitted, but it's alright. What we're going to do is put a piece of sandpaper on it so it's flat, and we're going to flatten this out until we can see it's a nice even surface. So first I'm going to put a bit of oil on there. A piece of sandpaper without holes in it would be nice, but this is what I've got. We'll keep turning it, rub it a bit, turn it, rub it a bit, turn it. And it should be starting, you can see where it's been touching the sandpaper and where it's still got the old surface on it. So I'll just do this a couple more times until it's nice and smooth, and this is ready to go back in. So that looks like it's a nice flat surface now. Turns nice and smooth. The reason I'm not too worried about this is all the force on this is pushing it this way, and this internal bore is not damaged. This top face here where it sits is really just, it's just pretty much so this sits in the right place. So even though it's got that chip in it, it's not going to be a problem to our use. Right, so this is the actual body of the rack. I sandblasted and painted it, like the same way you see me sandblast everything else, then you need to watch me sandblast stuff 100 times. But I taped up all the threads, so we'll go pull all the tape out of it. Alright, so we're going to start assembling this in a different order to the way we took it apart, because that happened. Now I'm going to start adding some grease to it. The grease I'm using is a molybdenum disulfide grease, so it's black and it gets absolutely everywhere. But what it is it's regular grease, but it's got molybdenum particles in it, and molybdenum is like a molecule, it's like these little flat plates, and they rub together really nicely. And so what happens is it actually gets stuck in all the metal, and so even when the grease part of it is sort of all gone and dried, the molybdenum is still there to help save it. The other thing is, under extremely high load, when the grease is squeezed out, the molybdenum, because it's impregnated into the metal then, doesn't squeeze out as easily. It's probably overkill for this, but it's not very expensive, so I might as well. We'll add a bit of it to the end, put a bit of it in the bush, and then we'll continue. So I'm just going to add a blob of it down inside the bottom of our bush. You can see it's all stringy as well, which is good. Like if your grease is sticky and stringy, it means it stays on spinning things without getting thrown off it. It also means it makes a massive mess everywhere. So the next thing I can do after that bush is inserted is slide this rack in. I still haven't actually removed the end of the tie rod, but there's not really a reason to actually remove it, so it's just going to stay on there till I put it back together. But we'll give this a good coat of grease and then put it in. Right, so I made sure to get a good amount of it in the rack portion of it. Now we're ready to slide it in. Right, so the next part we can put in now is our pinion. Same thing, I'll give it a good bit of grease on the gear portion of it. We've already filled the bottom bit where the bush goes with grease, but you can never have too much grease, so grease, 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 grease. So you can hear, hopefully you heard there, as I was tapping it, you could hear it was like a hollow sound. Once I got to the end, you could hear it was a louder noise. When you're hammering in things like this, it's all about the sound it makes. Like you can tell pretty much everything about how far it is and whether it's seated properly about the sound that it makes. So the reason it's a bit stiffer now is the rack pinion and the rack teeth have always meshed with the same bit for the last 50 years, whoever all this car is, and they've worn together, which has made it loosen up. Now that they're sort of matched with a different set of teeth, it's taken all the play out of it. So if it was like seized, that would be a problem, but being a bit stiffer now is fine. If anything, our steering should probably be a bit tighter than when it was before we pulled it apart, because now the teeth are meshing with new teeth again. So we're ready to screw our bearing retainer slash seal on. Now because we've got a sealed bearing in there, we don't really need grease between this and the bearing, so I'm going to put a tiny little smear of it around the seal just where it slides, and that's all we need on this side. Excess grease on this side is just going to like attract dirt and dust and stuff. Goes in so much nicer now that everything's been cleaned up. Oh yeah, I didn't show it in the other video. I cleaned up the threads on this with this. It's called a thread file. Basically, it's got all the different pitches on it, and on the end, this is a 1mm pitch thread, so I go along here, find the 1mm one which is here, and you can use these little teeth to scrape around the inside of it to clean paint and crap out, and then if you're doing an outside thread, say it's 1mm, you use this to cut into the outside threads. These are great little tools for fixing bolts and fixing like messed up threads and stuff. So we've got our tool that we made. Now, this was quite a struggle to get undone. It doesn't need to be that tight. This is just holding the bearing down. So we'll do it up tight, and that will be enough for us. We don't need to go swinging off it like with the old one. So now that we've got our seal and everything fitted, the little spline thing that drives the actual rack, we've cleaned off the paint on the surface we don't need it on. This is ready to go back on. Should slide through that seal. Now we've got a nice sealed rack full of grease. Feels nice and smooth, but like it's tight but it's smooth, if that makes sense. So we've got our little tension adjuster that goes in this hole next. We'll put a smear of grease on it. What I'm going to do is, this is the last opening into the rack. So what I'm going to do is pack some grease in the hole, slide the rack along a little bit, and then put another blob of grease in there to make sure that like we've got enough grease in there that once it all sort of gets hot and the grease starts flowing, that there's enough grease to sort of go around and keep everything coated. What I might do, actually, now that I think about it, I can use this thing to like pack the grease down inside there. Yeah, it works nicely. Alright, now we've got plenty of grease in there. This bit can go in there permanently. In you go, little thing. Make sure it still slides nicely, which it does. The spring that goes on top of it, we'll give that a bit of grease, make sure it doesn't sort of help it stop corroding. I wore a glove before, now I'm just doing this, but whatever. On top of that spring goes this little coin that holds it in. There was a spring clip for this which shot its way across the shed when I took it off. It was also pretty rusty and crap, so we'll put a new one in there. And turns out the biggest internal one I have is 20 and this is 25, so off to the shops, continue this tomorrow. So it's been like a week since I actually worked on this last, I forget what I'm up to. I've got the boots for it, I'm just cleaning up the tie rods. All these internal bits look okay. I'm just going to go and clean the rust off the middle section of the tie rod end. This bit's nice, I'm not going to sandblast any of these areas because they need to be smooth, but we'll clean the rust off that bit. You can see these are cleaned up now from the rust. There's actually a bit more pitting here than I was expecting. Like that's right where the rubber boots sit, so moisture obviously sat in there, but the wear surfaces down here are spotless, so the boots did their job and it's been full of grease for the last 50 something years. We'll put it back together. It'd be cool if they still sold rack ends like this that were rebuildable, but they don't. It's funny, all the ball joints on this car have grease nipples on them, so you can like add grease as you service the car. These ones don't, but I guess it's because they're underneath the rack boots, so like no one's going to be pulling the rack boots on and off every time they service the car to grease them, but it would be cool if they had grease nipples on them. They don't, so I've got some half decent grease. I'll put plenty of it in there and then it should last for the next 57 years, hopefully. Now that the tie rods are all cleaned up and nice and greasy and smooth, there's a little lock washer that goes on. Probably put the lock washer on here first. It just screws into the end. The one thing you have to make sure of is that while you're screwing it in, these little tabs lock into the right spot. If I can get it to screw in. So, can you see the camera? Yeah, you can. These little tabs lock in there, and then we do it up, and then once it's tight, I get the hammer and bash one of these corners into this little notch, and that means it can't unscrew, because if this unscrewed, your wheel would go all loose, and you'd probably crash like a tree, so... So you don't have to go nuts with it, it's just enough so that if it tries to unscrew, it'll stop it. Cool, now the piece that I was waiting this whole time for, which is just the rubber boot that goes on the end. I can get from Germany or wherever they come from, or Japan or something, remanufactured original copies of the rubber boots, but like it's a rubber boot, so these are universal ones. So with my boot, I'm just going to pick the size that I think will fit over this best. This is a bit of an odd shape, because normally on cars, like you get a flat section with a small lip on it. This has this like huge bell mouth, so this definitely is going to fall off, but it'd also be kind of hard to get on. I think the second step looks about right, so I'm just going to cut around it to give myself that size. So that's the one I want. As for the front, it's actually the smallest one, looks like it'll be the best, so I don't have to cut anything at the front. Before I put this on, I'm just going to put a final bit of extra grease. Look, get out of here. A final extra bit of grease on the rack, because these are going to be these are the last bit that's going to keep all the grease and everything in this end, because this rack doesn't have any sort of end seal on it like a power steering rack. Cool, so we'll just get our boot, probably push it all the way down this way. Get our boot, slide him on. Got to get it over this weird lip now. What the hell? Ah, I was like, why wouldn't it go through? I forgot they give you like a cable tie to put it on, and the cable tie's inside it, so that's why it wouldn't go on. It's weird they put such a big flared end on this. I guess it's because pretty much every other rack I've worked on like the more modern Hondas is a cast aluminium rack, whereas this is steel, and it was easier to form the steel like this than it is to do like a nice little bead on the end of it. There we go. So it feels like it sits pretty good with that lip in this first rib, so I'm going to leave it sitting like that. I figure because it's got this extra flat bit here that I didn't need to cut, second cable tie won't hurt. It's definitely not going to come off because it's got such a big lip on it, but I don't know, it kind of looks funny with that big flat bit there, so I'll go a second cable tie as well. I wonder how many cars actually use this big end on the small bit. Like every single car I've ever worked on, this is the size of the tie rod. Like what have I got? Like that's a this is a Cressida tie rod. Like they're all the same size. This is every single tire I've ever had is this big, so I don't know why they give you the concertina end that you can cut here, but I guess when you need it, you need it to be handy. It doesn't really hurt having it there when you don't need it. But that's it. Steering rack ready to go back in the car. Well, as much car as there is. I just realised, last bit before we're all done, almost forgot this piece. The little split pin that stops this from being able to unscrew itself. Yeah. Last thing to go in is this little nut. I haven't cleaned this up yet because I'm going to replace it, but what I'll do is just put it on here for now so I don't lose any of the parts. And once this is all in the car, I might end up having to rotate this part on the spline, but we'll find out. But other than that, we're finished. Alright, so I'm pretty happy with how that came out. It looks nice and new. I need to work out what I'm actually going to do with all these parts now, because they can't just roll around in a box like they were before, because they'll scratch each other. But I've got so many more bits left to do, like thousands of bits left to do, so follow me on YouTube, subscribe, whatever it's called on YouTube, and I'll be putting up all the updates. Let me know what you thought of the video, if it was too long, too short, want to see more of something. Also, if you see any random crap in the background of the video in the shed, and it's interesting, let me know, because I'm happy to do videos on all this other stuff, because I like playing with heaps of random stuff. But I'll see everybody on the next video. Hopefully that was a good one, and goodbye.